Today, 14 September, we're getting reports from the United States that no decision has so far been made to authorise, or rather confirm, permission for Ukraine to launch missile strikes deep inside Russia. In fact, the entire meeting, the whole discussion, which appears to have taken place between the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his delegation and the US President, based on the pictures and other indications that we have, seems to have been, frankly, rather bad-tempered. We have television pictures of the two delegations sitting down at a table, presumably in the White House. It struck me that the Americans looked stony-faced and frankly angry. President Biden looked especially so. So I have to say it's not always easy to read his face, because he's, well, often looks, in my opinion, somewhat less than pleased with the situation around him. But anyway, the meeting went on for 90 minutes. The president snapped twice at British reporters. One British reporter asked him a question about whether the United States was concerned about the comments that President Putin made yesterday, which I discussed in my program yesterday, the one in which Putin warned that if a decision was made to launch missile strikes deep inside Russia, the Russians would consider themselves to be in a state of war with the Western powers that had participated in those strikes. Anyway, the president snapped back that he didn't think about Putin. He wasn't in the business of thinking about Putin. Even more revealingly, later on, he also snapped at another British reporter, saying that he was speaking and that basically telling the British reporter not to interrupt him. It didn't look particularly friendly or particularly cheerful. Certainly that was my impression. And subsequently, Admiral Kirby, the spokesperson of the National Security Council, came out and made statements that the United States had so far, or at least had not made any changes to its policy with respect to deep strikes, long-range strikes against Russia. Now, there's been an article explaining what happened in The Guardian. I should say there's been many articles in various parts of the British media. The British media speaks generally about the disappointment of the British at facing this reaction, this response from the United States. But perhaps The Guardian is the most authoritative source now, because just as the Daily Telegraph was particularly close to the preceding Conservative government, which lost power in July, following the British general election on the 4th of July, so The Guardian is particularly close to the new Labour government which Keir Starmer leads. I am not saying, by the way, that anything that The Guardian says amounts to an official record. But anyway, it gives us as good a sense as we're likely to get of the mood and feeling at the time, at this particular point in time, within the Labour government and its senior officials. And we read, Starmer flew over from London on Thursday for the working meeting amid escalating tensions with the Kremlin after Britain had indicated that the US had agreed to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to bomb Russia. After the summit, Starmer said the meeting was not about a particular decision on Storm Shadow. Well, we've had a long and productive discussion on a number of problems, including Ukraine, as you'd expect, the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific, talking strategically about tactical decisions. I have to say, I find that an incredible sentence, talking strategically about tactical decisions, why not talk tactically about strategic decisions? I mean, meaningless language coming from a man who's not just a lawyer, but a king's counsel, but never mind. Anyway, we are then told that, however, Biden indicated the topic came under discussion between the leaders and their teams in response to a shouted question about asking how soon he was prepared to let Ukraine fire missiles deeper into Russia. Biden said, we're going to discuss that now. And then The Guardian goes on to tell us that neither of the two of the presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, were in the capital and available to meet Starmer because both were campaigning. I cannot imagine that Donald Trump wants to meet Starmer at this time. But I do think it is interesting that Kamala Harris stayed away or was away. Maybe she had a full schedule of campaigning. But she is also the Vice President of the United States, and one would perhaps expect that she would want to be party to any discussions on an issue like this, when the leader of the adversary superpower is talking about the United States possibly finding itself in a state of war. Just saying. But anyway, she chose to stay away. And I can't help but feel, and I accept this is my own personal view, many people will disagree, that the Vice President has made a perhaps politically wise decision to stay as far from this whole topic as she possibly can. Anyway, moving on, we then read that we read in other places that apparently the whole topic of deep strikes against Russia is going to be put back to the next meeting of all of the various Western officials, and indeed President Zelensky himself, which will take place at the forthcoming General Assembly session of the United Nations in New York in a couple of weeks' time. In other words, the Americans have kicked the can down the road. Now, for the best overall discussion of this and of the ins and outs of it, I would refer to a program that Ray McGovern, former CIA official, top CIA official, a leading analyst on Soviet and Russian affairs, and founder member of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Anyway, he's done a video in which he discusses all of this, and you can find it. And in that video, I think it's probably not going too far to say that essentially he's talking here about a climb down. At least that's my own interpretation of what happened. And it's Intel Roundtable with Johnson and McGovern, and you can find it, and it's all there. Anyway, let's press on. Climb down? Maybe. But on the American side, I would also say expression of realism. I mean, perhaps one shouldn't dwell too much on whether the Americans have backed off or whether they've climbed down. Rather, one should express relief that they have made what I consider to be the obviously correct decision. It's clear that there are some people in the administration who are very keen on this idea. I get the sense that Secretary Blinken is one of those people. But it's also clear that the policy, this whole idea of launching deep strikes against Russia, is strongly opposed by people in the Pentagon. In fact, they've made no attempt to conceal their strong disagreement about this whole policy. And indeed, in Britain, we've now finally had an authoritative voice also speaking out against this frankly bad idea. And the person in question is Lord Kim Darroch, former US and British ambassador to Washington, where, by the way, he got into some trouble, as I remember, during the previous Trump administration by saying some negative things about Donald Trump, which got into the public sphere. Anyway, he also became national security advisor to the previous government, and he's warned against this whole idea of deep strikes against Russia. And we get this from the Financial Times. Earlier on Friday, which is to say, this is from the Financial Times now, even as Biden and Starmer and their respective teams were meeting, Lord Kim Darroch warned that allowing long-range Storm Shadow missiles to be fired by Ukraine into Russia risked intensifying the conflict. Darroch, ex-ambassador to Washington, said Western allies should think carefully about Putin's warnings this week that the deployment of longer-range weapons against targets inside Russia would mean NATO would be at war with Moscow. We really don't want to escalate this, Darroch told the Financial Times. Asked about Putin's threats, Biden said on Friday, I don't think much about Vladimir Putin, etc. But then Darroch went on to say that just because Putin had previously not carried through on threats of reprisals when the West supplied battle tanks and missiles to Ukraine, it did not mean the same would apply to cruise missile strikes on his territory. If they are confident that he's bluffing, then fine, Darroch said. But he's bluffing until he isn't. Now, the last is a point I've made many times. Daniel Davis has also made it, that playing a game with the leader of a nuclear superpower, telling yourself all the time that he's bluffing, is an incredibly reckless game. Because, of course, if he is not bluffing, if you get it wrong, then you could find yourself in very, very real trouble. Trouble which could be, to say it mildly, existential. And just to repeat again, Darroch's words, if they're confident that he's bluffing, then fine. But he's bluffing until he isn't. And then Darroch went on to say, Darroch added that he was not convinced that using Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets in Russia would be a decisive factor in the war. And with respect to that, we've now had an excellent article in Responsible Statecraft by George Beebe, another top analyst previously for the CIA. And he makes essentially the same point. He says, not enough long-range missiles to make a difference for Ukraine. And he makes strong warnings as well. He says that Russia and the West are quickly running out of maneuvering room to avoid a head-on military collision. And then he discusses the entire military logic of this whole incredibly bad plan. And he makes many of the same points that, well, I have made. I mean, I made at length in my program yesterday. But I'm going to go over what George Beebe said, because, of course, he has been a senior official within the US intelligence community. Understanding Russia was his job. And on top of that, he has contacts and access to information and meets and talks with people who I am not able to talk to. Anyway, this is what he says, and this is from George Beebe. The military logic for testing Russia's resolve on this matter is unclear. There is little reason to believe that using air-launched cruise missiles will significantly increase Ukraine's chances of winning what has become a war of attrition, in which the Russians have enormous advantages over Ukraine in population and manufacturing capacity. The Russians are wearing down the Ukrainians' ability to put well-trained, well-equipped forces into battle, and air-launched cruise missiles will not change that. The Russians can adjust to long-range Ukrainian strike capabilities, as they have already adjusted to the provision of HIMARS, artillery, and ATACMS ground-launched missiles. They have moved supply depots, for example, and they have grown more effective in their use of electronic warfare countermeasures to neutralize advanced Western weaponry. To have a real impact on Ukraine's ability to damage the Russian homeland, the West would have to supply very large numbers of very long-range missiles, well beyond the small numbers of basic range models that reportedly are being considered. But the West has limited capacity to provide such numbers, and their provision would almost inevitably provoke direct Russian retaliation. The political logic behind green lighting deep strikes inside Russia is also obscure. There is little reason for optimism that such attacks would build pressure on Putin to end the war or drive him to the negotiating table, but there is good reason for concern that they will amplify his claims that Russia is fighting NATO, not the Ukrainian people. There are many examples in history of large-scale bombing campaigns galvanizing public resistance. And, as Bree points out, so far that has proved true with Russia's own strikes on Ukraine, which has stoked Ukrainian patriotism and anti-Russian attitudes. That, I believe, was true, by the way, earlier in the war. I think it is becoming less true as the situation on the front lines deteriorates. I think now the missile strikes across Ukraine, what they're doing is simply lowering Ukrainian morale. But I'm not going to get diverted at this point into a discussion of all of that. And then Beebe goes on to say any potential unintended consequence is that the escalating lethality of Western military support will harden Russian demands at any future bargaining table. The more that the more the West shows that it is willing to use Ukraine to strike into Russia, the more that the Russians will insist on extensive Ukrainian demilitarization as a condition of a settlement. Now, that is obviously true. And then he talks about the risks, and he says that the biggest danger is that Russia will feel compelled to restore deterrence, to show the West that it cannot endlessly increase the lethality and range of weapons it provides to Ukraine without some direct response from Russia. Putin will be under pressure in his own country to draw a hard line with some clear strike on a Western target, lest the West just keep deepening its involvement until Russia has few options other than large-scale war with NATO, which clearly Putin wants to avoid. Now, there's a lot more in George Beebe's piece, but everything that he says, all of the points I've just made, are obviously true. Giving a small number of limited-range cruise missiles, Storm Shadows specifically, perhaps ATACMS, conceivably the German Taurus missiles, as the Germans can be strong-armed into supplying them as well, to attack targets in Russia, the world's biggest country by far, with an enormous, sprawling military-industrial capacity, an immensely advanced air defense system, an immensely advanced electronic warfare system. It's not going to change the war. What it will do, is harden Russian attitudes and quite plausibly galvanize the Russians themselves into further measures. And one possibility, which I think people need to bear in mind, is this. If there are Ukrainian, let's call them Ukraine, if there are missile strikes on Russian cities, if large numbers of Russian civilians, for example, get killed in these missile strikes, well, many people are saying, George Beebe says in this article, that the Russian forces in Ukraine are not big enough to subjugate the entire country. I am, by the way, less sure about that than George Beebe is. It depends very much, or so it seems to me, what happens to Ukraine's army, and we will come to that shortly. But anyway, George Beebe and others correctly say that up to this point, the Russian government, Putin and his officials, have shown marked unwillingness to authorize a general mobilization, to build up Russian forces to the point where Beebe and others think they would be big enough to occupy and bring under control the whole of Ukraine. And the reason why supposedly Putin and his officials are unwilling to do that is because that kind of general mobilization might be deeply unpopular within Russian society. I think there is some truth to this. I don't think most people in Russia at this time would be at all happy to see a general mobilization. But I think an at least equally important factor, one which has been identified, by the way, by Eve Smith in her recent article, which I discussed in Naked Capitalism, in which she talked about Russian dilemmas and options in the war in Ukraine. Anyway, one other reason, I think, why the Russians have held back from a general mobilization is because there is already a labor shortage in Russia. This is creating problems, stresses in the economy. It is creating capacity constraints. And that is leading to inflationary pressures. The Russian central bank has just increased interest rates to 19%, precisely because of the inflationary pressures that it worries about, which are caused to a great extent by surging demand coming up against capacity constraints. Putin is not going to want to make those capacity constraints even bigger by calling up millions of workers from the civilian economy and deploying them in the military in order to wage the war in Ukraine. And that is an important constraint on Russian government actions up to this point, and is surely one of the key reasons why the Russian government has been reluctant to order a general conscription or mobilization. But if missiles start striking targets inside Russia, if it has the kind of galvanizing effect within Russia that George Beebe is talking about, well, one can begin to understand how that might change. Maybe at that point the demands in Russia for a general mobilization will grow to the point when Putin might decide, and the officials around him might decide, that a mobilization to end the war quickly is what the situation calls for. In that case, the only way the circle can be squared is to do that which Western officials pretend Putin has done, but which he has conspicuously not done, which is to put the entire economy on a war footing. In other words, to go over to a genuine war economy with price controls, detailed planning, rationing, and all of those things. And of course, in a mood where Russians feel that the country is under attack, where they want to support the army. That might even be a popular policy, as it was, for example, in the United States during the Second World War in the 1940s. And, of course, the result of that will be that with the military getting the priority of all economic activity and industrial production, and with the share of the economy allocated to military production increasing from perhaps 6% of GDP as it is today to maybe the kind 25% that we have seen, for example, in other wars, well, then at that point we could find that the whole military situation, not just in Ukraine, but in the whole territory of Europe, would start to change drastically. We have a situation today where Russia is producing perhaps 4.5 million to 5 million shells a year, already far more than what the United States and the Western powers can do. But for one, if Russia were indeed to move towards a full war economy, a real war economy in conditions of general mobilization, I personally would not be surprised if at that point, fairly quickly, the Russian economy could start moving towards production of shells at the rate of 1 million shells a month. I say that because, of course, steel and other materials would no longer be diverted to the civilian economy. They would all be focused on military production, including production of shells. And to those who say that that is unrealistic, the Soviet Union in the 1940s, during the Second World War, produced 100 million shells a year. Russia, with its bigger industrial base, significantly bigger and far more modern industrial base than the one the Soviet Union had in the 1940s, I think could comfortably achieve that. Just saying. Now, would that happen if we had missile strikes against Russia? Almost certainly not. I don't think that the missile strikes are going to be anywhere near enough to change Russian policy in the radical way that I have just described. But if you want to provoke the Russians into an outright mobilization, and a situation where they're not just mobilizing their population, their manpower to join the army, but also mobilizing their entire economy, moving, in other words, towards a war economy, then I would have thought that deep strikes against their country is probably the way to do it. In fact, is exactly the right way to go about doing it. But anyway, let's move on. The point is, this is an incredibly bad idea. There is no clear military rationale for this. No one has been able to come up with one. Zelensky is again talking about all kinds of targets that would be within reach of these missiles. He's again claiming that he's going to provide a list of these targets, which of course begs the question of why in that case has he not already done so. But the fact is, even if such targets in Western Russia existed, it's not going to change the war. Kim Darroch says so. George Beebe says so. I think people like this should be taken seriously, especially given that the Pentagon, by all accounts, thinks so as well. The risks involved in this policy are wholly out of proportion to the potential benefits, if there are benefits, of which, straightforwardly, I myself cannot see any. Anyway, it is good that the United States has therefore, for the moment, said no to this proposal. The British are annoyed, the Scandinavians are annoyed. Justin Trudeau has weighed in and has said that it should be done, but these are all people who don't have the kind of skin in the game that the United States does. I think the Americans are absolutely right for the moment to say no, and I hope very much that they continue doing so. Whether they will, that of course remains to be seen. As I've said many times, this is a bad idea, an extremely bad idea that simply will not die. Anyway, that now brings us back to the real war, the actual war, the ongoing war that is being fought out on the battlefronts in Ukraine, and where the situation for Ukraine simply goes on getting worse and worse and worse. Now, let me first of all begin with two articles, one which has appeared in CNN and one which has appeared on the website of all places, the BBC. Both institutions, CNN and the BBC, which one would not generally expect to be critical of the way in which the Ukrainians are conducting the war. Let me begin first with the article by CNN, because this article specifically deals with the question of Ukraine's Kursk offensive. Now, the article is titled, "Ukraine's Kursk offensive was seen as a major success, but it came at a huge cost." And we are then told over the course of the article that CNN has interviewed, I believe it's 14 Ukrainian soldiers. I get the sense some of them are officers who have participated in the fighting in Kursk. And of course, all of them want to remain anonymous, or most of them have. And they all are clearly under instructions to give the most optimistic spin that they possibly can to the Kursk offensive. But it's not difficult to see their doubts. We read, for example, all said the Kursk counteroffensive was a difficult operation with casualty rates on a par with other parts of the front line. They said it was getting tougher 5 weeks in, and some even questioned the decision to launch the incursion at a time when Ukraine was struggling to defend key towns and cities in the east of the country. It will get more and more difficult. There will be more artillery fire, more soldiers, and there will be very big and difficult battles. But we must do everything we can that improves our position. Ukraine wants peace, but peace when we win, not when we lose. One of the soldiers, who's Vasil, is reported as having said. Russia is sending a lot of troops and artillery to Kursk. We have a lot of guys who have been killed, and we have a lot of destroyed hardware, he said. And we learn that the Russians now have around 30,000 troops in the Kursk region. Zelensky and Syrskyi spoke about 60,000 troops. Notice that this number has been halved. I think this is about right. And by the way, 30,000 Russian troops seems to me to probably equal or perhaps exceed the number of Ukrainian troops in the region. And there's a lot of discussion about the fact that there are lots of Wagner forces present in Kursk, which is absolutely true. The Russians have themselves reported this. We're then told that the Russian counteroffensive, which began as CNN was drafting this article, has regained control of some territory, but it's only small tactical successes. We can disregard that. We will see shortly that that is certainly wrong. And we're told that overall, despite the fact that briefly things seem to be going well, things are now becoming harder. One soldier called Finn said Russia's fortifications were built very well, combining different types of defensive measures, for example, by placing mines underneath the anti-tank obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth. His entire team, 4 men with years of experience, was completely exhausted. They were among the first units to cross into Russia, tasked with demining and dismantling defences before Ukrainian infantry and artillery units arrived there. They spent 2 weeks in Kursk, working non-stop, catching a couple of hours of sleep here and there, always on alert. There were many casualties. One soldier pointed to the boots and said one could take a lot of DNA samples from them. Ukrainian DNA, unfortunately. He said that the fact that they were operating on foreign land in an area they didn't know made their mission uniquely challenging. One crew member of an armoured personnel carrier that was transporting Ukrainian infantry troops around the Kursk region told CNN his unit was sent there from Chasiv Yar on the Eastern Front and that he didn't know his way around and that the Ukrainians began to get increasingly disorganized and communications broke down. GPS and cell phone signals were jammed. The Ukrainians have been relying on Starlink internet services, but they're finding the service doesn't work at all in certain parts of Kursk region. The APC crew member, armoured personnel carrier crew member, said that communication disruptions meant that they couldn't contact their commander for many hours. The area has been experiencing drought for several months. The land is now very dry, which makes it even more challenging to move around in heavy vehicles that stir up dust. The armoured personnel carrier crew member and his commander spoke in northern Ukraine, where they were recuperating from injuries they said were sustained when two Ukrainian armoured personnel carriers crashed into each other because of very poor visibility and no navigation signals. And we're now told that by one sapper that his unit's mission in Kursk had changed dramatically recently. He said it was previously they were removing Russian defences and clearing minefields to enable Ukrainian infantry to advance deeper into Russia. Now, he said, they're doing the opposite, laying mines and preparing defences aimed at stopping Russian troops from pushing back. And overall, the impression is that Kursk has become another meat grinder. In other words, another area of the war where the Ukrainians are being ground down to no useful purpose as the Russians bring to bear their enormously superior artillery, air, and armoured forces against relatively lightly equipped and lightly armed Ukrainian troops, exposed, as these Ukrainian soldiers admit, in a situation which is unfamiliar to them and very difficult for them. And lest you think the expression meat grinder is too strong. We have one Ukrainian soldier amongst the ones who were interviewed by CNN. This is Vasil, sitting on a bench in Sumy with his bandaged legs stretched out and an IV needle protruding from near his elbow. Vasil said the front line was swarming with explosive Russian drones on the day he was wounded. Guys from another unit came by and I told them to be careful because it was like a drone slaughterhouse in there. And just that second, bang, he said, adding a few expletives. His mates told him he was lucky to survive. Holod, who was one of the first to get him after the blast, commended his calm demeanour after the attack. So there we go. I speak of the meat grinder. One Ukrainian soldier who was wounded talks about a slaughterhouse with the whole area, the sky swarming with Russian drones, FPV drones and suicide drones of many types and forms. Now, having discussed what this CNN article says about the situation in Kursk, I think it's only fair if I now actually turn to what is actually going on in terms of the front lines in Kursk. And, well, it seems that the Russians have not yet fully gained control of Lyubimovka. The Ukrainians have tried to hold their positions in this village, and there is still, at least as of the time, the last update that I saw, there's still heavy fighting going on in Lyubimovka. But all the other Russian gains that I was talking about, it seems that they have actually happened. And Group of Forces North has provided what seems to me a very confident update of the situation in the Kursk region. And they say this: on September 13th, we continue to destroy the enemy in the border areas of Kursk Oblast. In the Korenovo direction, we advanced considerably, forcing the Ukrainians out of a number of settlements. And we've been told that amongst them, these included places like Tolsty Lug and Pokrovsk and Darino and Nikolaevo Darino, all of them slightly to the south or west of Lyubimovka. Anyway, they then go on to say, the enemy conducted one counterattack which was unsuccessful and lost up to 15 men killed. In the south of Suja, despite heavy fighting and stubborn resistance, we continue to advance and push the enemy towards the state border. During the fighting, up to 10 enemy troops were killed and 2 vehicles were defeated. The Ukrainians continued their attempts to cross the border through the border in the Glushkovo district of Kursk region. During the day, we repelled 7 attacks with the use of engineering and armoured vehicles supported by tanks. Enemy losses amounted to more than 60 men, 2 tanks, an armoured personnel carrier, 6 armoured vehicles, an engineering vehicle. No breakthrough was allowed. The total advance of Russian troops in Kursk region amounted to 4,000 meters, 4 kilometers. Now that, I think, is the biggest advance that Group of Forces North has claimed up to now. They've claimed 3 kilometers, 3.5 kilometers. Now they say that they've advanced by 4 kilometers. I don't exactly know what that means, by the way. Do they mean that they've advanced 4 kilometers in one direction? Or do they mean that they've acquired control of territory in all kinds of places, which the furthest extent of which is 4 kilometers? Or what exactly do they mean? But anyway, overall, they seem to be implying an accelerated state of advance. And they are also making the point that after the setbacks in Kursk. Zelensky has started talking again about peace talks, but in fact his so-called peace plan does not envisage peace, but only confirms his intention to wage war. And they then go on to say that if the war ends, Zelensky's regime will fall, and for that reason they don't expect that there will ever be peace so long as Zelensky remains president. And perhaps reflecting the sentiment of the Russian army, they quote Bismarck: "The great question of the age will be decided not by speeches and majority resolutions, but by iron and blood." And, well, that strongly points to Group of Forces North, the soldiers of Group of Forces North, probably reflecting the sentiments of the Russian army as a whole, wanting a military end to the war, a situation where the war ends in final and complete victory. Just saying, factor not to be disregarded, including by Putin himself. But anyway, the Russians, according to their accounts, very much still on the advance in Kursk region. And most observers of what is going on in Kursk region confirm that this is so. Maybe the advances are not quite as fast or as deep as Group of Forces North say. Maybe their claim that they've advanced by 4 kilometers is an overstatement. And as I said, they're not completely clear about what that means or what the time period that they're talking about is. But anyway, the point is that they are advancing. And not only are they advancing, but again, to repeat a point I've made previously, if the Russians capture Lyubimovka and capture Novo-Ivanovka, which is another village, which I believe the Ukrainians control, then the next village further west, directly to the west of Novo-Ivanovka, is Malaya Lochnia, where we know that the Russians already are. And another possibility is that the Russians could push south, or rather west, from Darino and Nikolaevo-Darino, and capture the village of Sverdlikovo, which is located just on the border between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, if the Russians were to capture Sverdlikovo, the Ukrainians would be in a profound crisis. We would at that point be justified in talking about the collapse of this entire pocket, this entire enclave that the Ukrainians have managed to seize in Kursk region. I'm not saying that that's the Russian plan. I'm not saying that's where we are at the moment, but we appear to be getting closer and closer to that point. And of course, Group of Forces North, without providing us with any information, is saying that the Russians are also advancing in the southern part of Sudzha district, which presumably relates to places like Borki and Ruskaya Konopielka. These are already very close to Sudzha itself. Sudzha, by the way, is now being heavily bombed by the Russian Air Force, and the Russians are conducting significant artillery strikes against it, as is a well-established pattern in this war. Once the Russians start bombing a place like Sudzha, it's usually a sign that they're intending at some point to begin a storming operation to seize it. So anyway, whole situation in Kursk region deteriorating, and as CNN admits, some of the soldiers who fought for Ukraine in Kursk question the wisdom of the offensive there, and all of them talk about very heavy losses comparable to the losses Ukraine has suffered everywhere else on the battlefronts, and effectively, quietly, they're all conceding that the situation for the Ukrainian soldiers is becoming more difficult all the time and that they have been thrown back on the defensive, which is, of course, exactly what we see. So that's the CNN article, and that is the situation in Kursk region. But an even more extraordinary article has been published by the BBC. And I'm now going to turn to that because it's perhaps the most dramatic article of all. It talks about the situation in southwestern Donbass, the area covered by Vuhledar and Pokrovsk and all of these places. And it talks about the Ukrainians finding themselves continuously now in cauldrons and of the situation becoming critical. And this article has appeared within the last few hours, so it's very fresh. And this is what we read. The title of the article, by the way, is Ukrainians warn of being surrounded as Russia advances in east. The situation is critical, a Ukrainian military officer in the east told the BBC, near the front line south of Pokrovsk. Russia's military strategy now appears to be to surround the city, that's to say Pokrovsk, which is a key transportation hub in the region. The officer, who preferred to stay anonymous, said his military leadership want to hold their positions at all costs, often leading to the loss of troops and resources. The approach, he says, was resulting in a number of cauldrons. We know what cauldrons are, encirclements, large territories surrounded by Russian forces. One of them is south of Pokrovsk, between Nevolskoye, Gernik and Krasnogorovka. We are not planning to advance towards the city of Donetsk anytime soon, so why are we holding positions near Nevolskoye when we're losing Gernik? Asked the officer. I've asked exactly the same question in many programs, and he then goes on to say far better to retreat to Gernik with a minimum loss of resources and hold those positions. When your enemy has more people and resources than you do, this strategy is reckless. Look at Donetsk region. It looks like a squid. To defend all the tentacles, you need a far bigger number of positions, observation posts. You need to hold back far bigger assault groups because the Russians are trying to attack from all sides. So instead of withdrawing and reducing the length of the line, they need to defend. The officer says Ukrainian brigades get wiped out fighting along the entire perimeter of the cauldron simply because the main criteria of success for generals is to hold positions. And we are told that some Ukrainian troops have in fact been retreating from the Nevolskoye pocket, cauldron. But here we have confirmation from the Ukrainian sources themselves that there are incomprehensibly still Ukrainian troops there. And the Ukrainian officer who has been speaking to the BBC talks about how lives and resources have been wasted in the Nevolskoye area on something that they couldn't hold anyway. And we're then told that Russian troops are now advancing towards Kurakovo, a city 35 kilometers south of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian forces in the area confirm the fighting in the sector has intensified. And we're then told by another officer, Major Sergei Tsikhotsky of the 59th Brigade, they are trying to strengthen their flanks. The Russians, are trying to strengthen their flanks so that they can get closer to Pokrovsk, half encircle it, and start erasing the city to the ground. And another officer, Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Demanenko, who commands a tank battalion of the 110th Brigade, also says that Russian forces are now pushing along the sides in addition to a direct assault on Pokrovsk. However, he claims that the Russians are now focusing mostly on the southern flank, that's the Kurachovo direction. And then there's discussions about Russian tactics, which I'm going to skip, and about how the Ukrainians, for the moment, are resisting the Russian advances. But overall, we're told strategic mistakes made in the past mean that there is only one way left to defend Pokrovsk and stop the Russians seizing the entire Donetsk region, according to the officer on the front line, and that is to have another Bakhmut. In other words, to defend Pokrovsk for nearly a year before retreating with the city in ruins. That apparently is the only way to try to resist the situation. I've already said why it is my belief that defending Pokrovsk in this way is going to prove impossible. There isn't the operational depth around Pokrovsk, the locations around Pokrovsk, that would make doing such a thing possible. Well, what is the situation? What is the situation now in this huge area where this tremendous battle is taking place? Well, a couple of days ago, there were all sorts of reports from various Russian channels that the Russians in the area of Vuhledar had captured the two coal mines, South Donbass number 1, which is located to the north of Vuhledar itself, and South Donbass number 3, which is located to the northwest of the village of Vodyanye, which the Russians have now conclusively captured. And of course, South Donbass number 3 is also on the way to the village of Bogoyavlenka, which is the main supply base that the Ukrainian army uses. Well, it's now clear that the Russians may have captured many of the facilities of South Donbass number 1, the coal mine near Vuhledar, but they haven't yet captured the slag heap, and that there hadn't been, at the time of those initial reports, an assault on the other coal mine, South Donbass number 3. But that assault has now happened, and we have had absolutely astonishing, incredibly dramatic footage of these assaults from the Russians, particularly the assault on the northern coal mine, South Donbass number 3, the one that is located northwest of Vodyanye and on the way to Bogoyavlenka. And we see a column of Russian armor moving towards this coal mine. Apparently there were 2 columns advancing on this coal mine from 2 directions. The striking thing for me is that there appears to be no effective resistance from the Ukrainians as these 2 armoured columns converged on the coal mine. As far as I could see, there was no pictures or images of any Russian armoured vehicle being damaged or destroyed at all. Anyway, the coal mine was attacked from 2 directions. Presumably there's a firefight, a battle going on inside the coal mine. I don't know whether the Russians have captured the coal mine in its entirety, but it is highly plausible that they have done. And if they have not, it's highly plausible that they will do very soon. And about coal mine number 1, South Donbass number 1, the one closer to Vuhledar, there it's more difficult for me because the pictures are far less clear, or at least there's fewer of them. But it does seem as if there's a battle going on in some of the remaining facilities of the coal mine still under Ukrainian control, including the slag heap. And I'm going to make a guess. Apparently there's some pictures that show Russian troops on the slag heap. I'm not saying whether this is necessarily the case or not. But anyway, it's likely that that coal mine is going to be captured as well. If South Donbass number 1 and South Donbass number 3 are captured, the way is open for the Russians to attack Bogoyavlenka and to cut the remaining supply road to Vuhledar. At that point, the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison in Vuhledar is trapped, and we come back to what that Ukrainian officer was complaining about to the BBC. We will have another cauldron, a cauldron in which one of Ukraine's best brigades, the 92nd Brigade, is trapped in Vuhledar. It might put up a resistance for some time. It might tie down Russian troops for some time, but sooner or later Vuhledar will fall and this vital brigade will be lost by the Ukrainians. And to repeat again, given that the Russians now outnumber the Ukrainians, and given that that difference in manpower is going to increase as the remaining months of 2024 drag out, well, it is the Ukrainians who cannot afford to lose troops in places like Vuhledar. And just as the Ukrainian officer said that the Ukrainians should have withdrawn their men from the Nevolskoy pocket and withdrawn them to Girnik, which they're now, by the way, about to lose. So they should now withdraw their troops from Vuhledar and abandon Vuhledar whilst they still can. The Ukrainian officer complained that the Ukrainian generals assess success by whether they hold positions on a map, regardless of cost, and we see how the Ukrainian army is paying the price of this. And the same thing is now happening further north in Ukrainsk. There was a major battle. There have been reports on the Russians that they now control all of the residential areas of Ukrainsk. That may or may not be true. We haven't seen any pictures that confirm it. But we have seen pictures which appear to confirm something else, which is that the Russians have now fully outflanked Ukrainsk, that they control the coal mine and the slag heap immediately to the north of Ukrainsk. In fact, there are said to be pictures which show the Russian troops on the coal mine, on the slag heap. There are also reports that the Russians have outflanked Ukrainsk from the south, and the general effect is that whatever Ukrainian troops are still in Ukrainsk and perhaps fighting in the coal mine area, perhaps on the slag heap or whatever part of the slag heap the Ukrainians still control, that those troops also are now in a cauldron. And apparently this is such a tight cauldron that it is all but impossible for the Ukrainians to retreat from it. So another Ukrainian force, brave men, are now trapped to hold on to a place like Ukrainsk, and a place of 10,000 people. Important strategically in terms of the battle of places like Selidovo further north and Kurakhovo further south, but Selidovo and Kurakhovo are effectively lost all already. As I pointed out in my program yesterday, the Russians have just captured the village of Gostia, just west of Kurakovo. They're pushing through towards Kurakovo from Maximilianovka, a little to the south. They're occupying all these fields now that the Nevolskoye pocket has been collapsed. They're likely to have control of Vuhledar fairly soon. Kurakovo clearly is not going to remain under Ukrainian control for very long. Selidovo isn't going to remain under Ukrainian control for very long. We've now had multiple sightings of where the Russians are in Selidovo. And, well, here again, the facts apparently tell us a dismal story. It clearly shows that the Russians are indeed now occupying many locations in eastern Selidovo. The Ukrainian counterattacks in Selidovo have lost momentum. The Russians are pushing back. They've reoccupied quite a lot of the territory in eastern Selidovo. And, well, there's been various brave attempts by various reporters and commentators to claim that the Ukrainians were hanging on to the village of Marinivka, immediately to the north of Selidovo. I've always been skeptical about these. The latest reports were that the Ukrainians in Marinivka were all but surrounded. If there were that many Ukrainian troops there, another cauldron, in other words, or potential cauldron. Apparently they've now fled, so that Marinivka is fully under Russian control. Marinivka almost certainly under Russian control. The coal mine and the slag heap to the north of Selidovo, either under Russian control or likely to be, again, fairly soon. Again, what is the point of dragging this out, holding on to places like Selidovo, which are in effect lost already? Ukraine playing for time? Time to achieve what exactly? What is it that the Ukrainians think that they're going to achieve by dragging on the war in the way that they are? That the West will come to their rescue? That's presumably the whole business about the long-range missile strikes. We see the fears and worries on this that afflict the United States. The fact that the United States is split on this, the US government is split on this, and for the moment at least, the US is unwilling to go down that route. The other Western countries, Britain, pushing to continue the war, but the British are in no position to provide the Ukrainians with the kind of help that the Ukrainians would need to win the war. So, what are the Ukrainians doing? Dragging out the war in the way that they are. Group of Forces North say that this is all connected to President Zelensky's political survival. I said this myself in the past. Well, is that, however, a reason why other Ukrainians should want a war that is now clearly being lost to be prolonged and protracted in this way? Defending isolated places like Vuhledar, Kurakovo, Girnik, Selidovo, the fields west of Nevolskoye and all of those places. It makes no sense militarily or politically. One might have thought that peace talks are the obvious way forward. I've discussed this many times. But as we have seen, the Ukrainians, or at least the Ukrainian leadership, seems structurally incapable of doing that. And in the meantime, Ukraine's army continues to be bled dry. Now, there's been further news from other parts of the battlefronts. The Russians are now bombing Pokrovsk systematically, though not anywhere near as heavily as I suspect before long they will. The Russians have made further advances inside Toretsk. This is a slow, grinding battle fought out inside a city. There's no doubt now that they control New York, including the industrial area of New York. The Russians, as I said, grinding forward through Toretsk. They're now almost at the center of Toretsk. There doesn't seem to be anything the Ukrainians can do to resist them. The Russians are clearing all the territory around Chasiv Yar. They've reached the Seversky Donets aqueduct west of Klashayevka. They're pushing all Ukrainian troops, the remaining Ukrainian troops, beyond the aqueduct. Likely before long, we're going to see a general offensive. And I've noticed that even Redovka is now pointing out that these Russian troops west of Klashayevka on the Seversky Donets aqueduct are now posed to launch a potential offensive against Konstantinovka itself, the city that lies to the southwest of Chasiv Yar, and which the Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar are supposed to be defending. And around Chasiv Yar itself, we hear that the Russians have advanced into the central areas, but that their primary focus at the present time is gaining further control of the flanks, pushing the Ukrainians, especially on the northern flanks, so that Chasiv Yar can be attacked from multiple directions in the north, from the north. Again, the Battle of Chasiv Yar, another meat grinder for the Ukrainian army, one that gets less attention than it should, but a battle which is gradually dragging out towards its end, with the Ukrainians sacrificing large numbers of brave men, of their best men, to defend a town which is going to fall soon anyway. Now, I've made this point many times about negotiations. George Beebe, in that article in Responsible Statecraft that I talked about, says that what Ukraine needs is not long-range missiles. What it needs is a ceasefire. Now, I've discussed in recent programs how the Russians have been somewhat irritated by demands from some of their friends, India and Brazil, or rather not demands, but proposals from some of their friends that they move forward towards some kind of negotiated solution. The Russians are not keen to do that at the moment, but they are under some pressure. And an intelligent Ukrainian government might have been able to make use of that to its own advantage to try to force the Russians into a ceasefire that they don't want. But the Ukrainians don't seem to be interested in that. They're talking about a plan for victory instead. Delusional stuff, but there is no one in authority in Ukraine who seems to be able to argue against it. And as for the West, well, it's possible that the West, especially the United States, might be able to cut a deal with the Russians. It would be an incredibly difficult thing to do. Trust between the United States and Russia has all but collapsed. And as I've said, as Group of Forces North, the comments by Group of Forces North shows, the Russian military, for its part, absolutely does not want to see a negotiated settlement of this war. John Helmer discussed all of that with Alex Christoforou and myself in a live stream that we did for the Duran, and I personally have no doubt about it. So, the United States, nonetheless, perhaps might persuade the Russians to go for some kind of negotiated solution. It might conceivably team up with India and Brazil to try and make proposals that the Russians might feel that they must at least discuss and work with. There have been some interesting ideas which have come forward from J.D. Vance, for example. But what has been happening instead? A long discussion about launching long-range missile strikes against Russia, which instead of preparing the ground for negotiations, is almost inevitably going to destroy whatever remaining prospect of that there still is, and ultimately guarantee the destruction of Ukraine. I've said this before, I've said it many times. I'm going to say it once again. Never in my lifetime have I known of a situation where Western policy, Western diplomacy, Western thinking about a conflict has been as bad as it has been about this one. The level of obduracy and intransigence and inability to address the realities, the constant search for dangerous schemes and ideas, of which the long-range missiles is just the latest one, which, far from resolving the situation in a way that the West might want, is only going to prolong it and make the eventual outcome from a Western point of view even worse. Well, it simply takes my breath away. And it's not as if the West doesn't have problems. There's just been a meeting in Italy where all the leaders of the European states, the EU states, came together and talked with each other about how bad the economic situation in Europe was, how Europe is being left behind in the technological race with the United States and China, how expensive high energy costs was a major cause of the problem. What did we get? An attempt to try to address these problems which do exist, through seeking peace in Europe by negotiating an end to the conflict in Ukraine? No, nothing of the sort. Instead, far-fetched, over-ambitious plans for a programme of public investment organised by the EU Centre, costing $800 billion a year over 5 years. By the way, there have been multiple plans hatched by the European Union of this kind. I remember an almost identical plan that the European Union came up with in the early 1990s, and then there was a similar plan in the early 2000s, and they were announced, and they came to nothing and achieved nothing. And this plan, if it's ever launched, is also going to achieve nothing. And it cannot achieve anything, even if this were a good plan, which, by the way, it isn't, until there is a secure, stable, and sustainable peace in Europe. But no one at that conference in Italy wanted to face that reality or talk about it or understand that talking to the Russians, who are and have been a part of European history since the 16th century and arguably long before, nobody wants to do that. So they talk about long-range missiles, they come up with these incredible plans, and every single day, Ukraine on the battlefields gets ground down. Unlike George Babe, he continues to think that the Russians aren't going to be strong enough to occupy the whole of Ukraine. I think in military terms, we will eventually get to the point when they are, that there simply won't be that capacity by Ukraine to continue the resistance that we have seen up to this point. The only limits on what the Russians might want to do are diplomatic and political and economic ones, not, in my opinion, military ones. And I don't think that that is what the Putin government wants to do, for all kinds of very good reasons discussed by Eve Smith and George Beebe and others. But if that's the outcome we want to bring about, the complete destruction and collapse of Ukraine and the demographic collapse of the country, which is apparently the demographic situation in Ukraine is now the worst recorded anywhere in the world, well, we are going about it all in exactly the right way. Well, this is where I'm going to end this program today. Somewhat bitter words at the end, but I think the situation justifies them. Let me say again, just as well for the moment, that the plan for long-range missile strikes has been put back, if not fully and finally shelved. But anyway, I won't repeat myself. Let me repeat again, though, that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you want to support our channel, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.